Chapter 13, Part 3 of Nana by Émile Zola, translated by Burton Rascoe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 13, Part 3. But she remembered him with pleasure. They had amused themselves so much together with that idiot Lavalloise. They would never perhaps have thought of being together again if the pleasure of humbugging such a fool had not excited them. It seemed to them so funny. They would embrace each other under his nose, they lived the merriest possible life at his expense, they would send him on some errand to the other end of Paris whenever they wanted to be alone together. Then when he returned they would make jokes and allusions that he was unable to understand. One day, incited by the journalist, she bet that she would give Lavalloise a slap in the face. That very evening she did so, then continued to beat him, finding it amusing, and delighted at being able to show what cowards men were. She called him her slapping machine, told him to come up and receive his slaps which made her hand quite red because she was not yet accustomed to the exercise. Lavalloise laughed in his idiotic way with his eyes full of tears. This familiarity delighted him. He thought it grand. "You don't know," said he one night, very excited after receiving a shower of blows, "you ought to marry me. Eh, shouldn't we make a jolly couple?" It was not an empty remark. He had slyly projected this marriage, seized with a mania for astonishing Paris. Nana's husband. Eh, what an effect! A rather grand apotheosis. But Nana snuffed him out in fine style. "I marry you? Well, if I'd been worried with any such idea I could long ago have found a husband. And a man who would be worth 20 such as you, my little fellow. I have received no end of proposals. Come, reckon them up with me. Philippe, Georges, Foucarmont, Steiner, there's 4, without counting the others whom you don't know. They all sing the same chorus. I can't be nice with them without they at once start off singing, 'Will you marry me? Will you marry me?'" She was becoming excited. Then she burst out indignantly, "Well, no, I won't. Was I ever made for such a life as that? Look at me. I should no longer be Nana if I saddled myself with a husband. And, besides, it's too disgusting." And she spat on the ground, she hiccuped with disgust, as though she saw all the filth of the earth spreading beneath her. One night Lavalloise disappeared. A week later it was stated that he was in the country with his uncle, who had a mania for botanizing. He mounted his specimens and stood a chance of marrying a cousin who was very ugly and extremely devout. Nana did not weep for him much. She merely said to the Count, "Well, my little muff, that's another rival the less. You're in high feather to day." But he was becoming serious. He wanted to marry me. As he turned pale, she laughingly put her arms round his neck, thrusting each of her cruelties into him with a caress. "And it's that which bothers you, isn't it? You can't marry Nana. Whilst they're all trying to get me to marry them, you're chafing all alone in your corner. It's not possible. You must wait till your wife croaks." "Ah, if your wife was to croak, wouldn't you just hasten to me? Wouldn't you just throw yourself at my feet and offer me everything, all the usual style, with sighs and tears and protestations? Eh, darling, it would be so nice." Her voice had become soft. She fooled him with an air of ferocious cajolery. He, deeply moved, blushed as he returned her embraces. Then she cried, "Damn it all! To think that I guessed right! He has thought of it, he's waiting till his wife croaks. Ah, well, this is too much! He's a bigger scamp than the others." Muffat had accepted the others. Now he made it a last point of dignity to remain the master with the servants and the frequenters of the house. The man who, giving the most, was the official lover. And his passion became madder than ever. He kept his place by paying, buying even smiles at fabulous prices, often robbed and never receiving his money's worth. But it was like a disease that was devouring him. He could not help suffering from it. When he entered Nana's bedroom, he contented himself with opening the windows for a minute so as to get rid of the odours left by the others. The effluvia of both dark and fair, the cigar smoke, the staleness of which nearly suffocated him. The room was becoming a public square. Boots of all kinds were continually being wiped on the threshold, and not one was arrested by that bloody mark which barred the entry. Zoe was greatly worried by that stain, merely a tidy girl's mania. She was annoyed at always seeing it there. Her eyes were attracted to it in spite of herself. She never entered Madame's room without saying, "It's funny it doesn't go away. Yet a great many people come here." Nana, who had been receiving better news of Georges, then in a state of convalescence at Les Fondettes with his mother, each time made the same reply. "Ah, well, you must give it time. It's gradually becoming paler beneath the footsteps." And indeed each one of the gentlemen, Foucarmont, Steiner, La Falloise, Fauchery, and the others, had carried away a little of the stain on the soles of their boots. And Muffat, who was worried as much as Zoe by the mark of blood, studied it in spite of himself, to read as it were in its rosier and rosier effacement the number of men who passed there. He had a secret dread of it, always stepping over it through a sudden fear of crushing something living, a naked limb lying on the floor. Then in that room an unconquerable feeling intoxicated him. He forgot all, the mob of other men who passed through it, the mourning that barred the door. Outside, at times, in the open air of the street, he would shed tears of shame and indignation and swear never to return there; and the moment he had passed the threshold he was recaptured. He felt his will give way in the warmth of the apartment; his flesh penetrated with a perfume, overpowered by a voluptuous desire of annihilation. He, devout, and used to the rapturous feelings enkindled by the contemplation of gorgeous shrines, experienced exactly the same sensations of a believer as when, kneeling in some church, he became entranced by the sounds of the organ and the perfume of the incense. The woman ruled him with the jealous despotism of a god of anger, terrifying him, giving him seconds of joy, acute as spasms, for hours of frightful torments, of visions of hell and everlasting damnation. It was always the same stutterings, the same prayers, and the same despondencies, especially the same humilities of an accursed creature crushed beneath the mud of his origin. The desires of his flesh, the requirements of his soul, mingled and seemed to rise from the obscure depths of his being, like a single blossom of the tree of life. He abandoned himself to the power of love and faith whose double lever animates the world. And always, in spite of the struggles of his reason, Nana's room filled him with madness. He shiveringly succumbed to the all-powerfulness of her sex, the same as he felt lost before the vast unknown of heaven. Then, when she found him so humble, Nana's triumph became tyrannical. She instinctively had a rage for debasing everything. It was not sufficient for her to destroy things, she polluted them. Her delicate hands left abominable traces behind them. They decomposed by their mere touch all that they had broken. And he, idiot that he was, lent himself to this sport with the vague remembrance of saints devoured by lice, and who eat what they had voided. When she had him in her room with the doors fastened, she would feast herself with the sight of man's infamy. At first it was merely fun. She would give him little slaps, and make him do comical things, such as lisping like a child, repeating ends of sentences. "Say it like me," and "Dash it all, Coco doesn't care." He would be obedient even to imitating her accent. "And dash it all, Coco doesn't care." Or she would do the woolly bear on all fours on the fur rugs in her chemise, and turning round and round, and grunting, as though she meant to eat him up; and she would even bite his calves, just for fun. Then she would get up and say, "Now it's your turn. I bet you won't do the woolly bear as well as me." It was charming. She amused him as a bear, with her white skin and her golden mane. He laughed. He also went on all fours, he grunted and bit her calves, whilst she hopped about pretending to be greatly frightened. "Aren't we stupid, eh?" she would end by saying. "You've no idea how ugly you look, my dear. Ah, well, if they could only see you now at the Tuileries." But these little games soon took an ugly turn. It wasn't through cruelty on her part, for she still remained a good-natured girl. It was like a breath of madness, which passed and increased little by little in the closed room. A lewdness seemed to possess them, and inspire them with the delirious imaginations of the flesh. The old devout frights of their night of wakefulness had now turned into a thirst for bestiality, a mania for going on all fours, for grunting and biting. Then one day, as he was doing the woolly bear, she pushed him so roughly that he fell against a piece of furniture, and she broke out into an involuntary laugh as she saw a bump on his forehead. From that time, having already acquired a taste for it by her experiment on La Valoise, she treated him as an animal, goaded him and pursued him with kicks. "Gee up, you're the horse. Ha, gee, dirty jade! Move along quicker than that." At other times he was a dog. She would throw her scented handkerchief to the other end of the room, and he had to go and pick it up with his teeth, crawling along on his hands and knees. "Fetch it, Cæsar. I'll give you the stick if you're not quick. Good dog, Cæsar. Pretty obedient fellow. Now beg." And he delighted in his baseness, and relished the enjoyment of being a brute. He aspired at falling still lower. He would cry out, "Hit harder! Bow wow! I'm mad! Hit away!" She was seized with a caprice. She insisted on his coming one evening arrayed in his gorgeous chamberlain's costume. Then she laughed and ridiculed him when she had him in his court dress with the sword and the hat and the white breeches, and the scarlet cloth dress coat bedizened with gold, and the symbolical key hanging over the left-hand tail. This key especially amused her, and filled her with a mad fancy for filthy explanations. Always laughing and carried away by a disrespect for greatness, and by the delight of vilifying it beneath the official pomp of that costume, she shook him and pinched him, and kept exclaiming, "Hey, get along, you Chamberlain!" ending by accompanying her words with kicks behind; and she heartily meant those kicks for the Tuileries, for the majesty of the Imperial Court, throning herself on high over the fear and the prostration of all. That was what she thought of society. It was her revenge, an unconscious family grudge bequeathed with the blood. Then the Chamberlain having undressed, his coat spread out on the floor, she cried to him to jump, and he jumped. She cried to him to spit, and he spat. She cried to him to walk over the gold, over the eagles, over the decorations, and he walked. Slap, bang, there was nothing left. All had collapsed. She demolished a Chamberlain as easily as she broke a scent bottle or a comfit box, and she turned him into a lump of filth, a heap of mud at a street corner. The goldsmiths, however, had not kept their word. The bedstead was not delivered until towards the middle of January. Muffat at the time was in Normandy, where he had gone to sell a last remnant of the wreck. He was not expected back until 2 days later; but, having settled his business, he hastened his return, and without even calling at the Rue Miromesnil, he went to the Avenue de Villiers. 10 o'clock was striking. As he had a key of a little door opening on to the Rue Cardinet, he entered without being noticed. Upstairs in the parlor, Zoe, who was dusting some bronzes, was struck with amazement; and, not knowing how to detain him, began telling him a long story about Monsieur Venot, who, in a most agitated state of mind, had been seeking him since the day before; that he had already called there twice, and implored her to send the Count at once to him, if he came to Madame's first. Muffat listened to her without understanding anything of the rigmarole. Then he noticed her confusion, and, seized suddenly with a jealous rage of which he no longer thought himself capable, he rushed against the door of the bedroom, from whence issued sounds of laughter. The door gave way and flew open, whilst Zoe retired, shrugging her shoulders. So much the worse. As Madame was going mad, Madame must get out of the mess by herself. And Muffat, on the threshold, uttered a cry at the sight before him. My God! My God! The newly decorated room was resplendent in its regal luxury. Silver buttons strewed the tea rose velvet hangings with shining stars. It was the rosy color of flesh which illuminates the sky on fine nights, when Venus sparkles at the horizon on the light background of the expiring day; whilst the cords of gold hanging down at the corners, the gold lace framing the panels, were like bright flames, or loose switches of red hair, half covering the great nudity of the room, the voluptuous paleness of which they enriched. Then, opposite, was the gold and silver bedstead, which shone with the new brightness of its chasings; a throne large enough for Nana to stretch the royalty of her naked limbs; an altar of a Byzantine richness, worthy of the all-powerfulness of her sex, and on which, at this very moment, she displayed it, uncovered, and in the religious immodesty of a dreaded idol. And near her, beneath the snowy reflection of her bosom, in the midst of her goddess-like triumph, sprawled a shameful and decrepit object, a comical and lamentable ruin, the Marquis de Choir, in his nightshirt. The Count joined his hands. Seized with a great fit of trembling, he repeated, "My God! My God!" It was for the Marquis de Choir that the golden roses of the boat flowered, bunches of golden roses blooming amidst the golden foliage. It was for him that the Cupids, dancing in a circle against the silver trellis, leant forward with a laugh of amorous sauciness; and it was for him that the faun at his feet uncovered the sleeping nymph, wearied with voluptuousness, that figure of Night, copied from Nana's celebrated nudity, even to the two amply developed thighs which would cause every one to recognize her. Thrown there like a piece of human rubbish, corrupted and shattered by 60 years of debauchery, the Marquis appeared as a corner of a charnel house surrounded by the glory of the woman's dazzling flesh. When he saw the door open he raised himself up, seized with the fright of a paralytic old man. This last night of licentiousness had smitten him with imbecility, he had fallen into his second childhood; and no longer able to find his words, half paralyzed, stuttering, shivering, he remained in an attitude of flight, his nightshirt rucked up over his skeleton of a body, one leg outside the clothes, a poor livid leg covered with grey hairs. Nana, in spite of her annoyance, could not help laughing. "Lie down! Get under the clothes!" said she, pushing him back and covering him with the sheet, like some bit of dirt one does not wish to be seen. And she ran to close the door. She had really no luck with her little Muff. He was always putting in an appearance at an awkward moment. And why, too, did he go off to seek for money in Normandy? The old fellow had brought her 4,000 francs, and she had let him have his way. She pushed the door to again, and cried, "So much the worse! It's all your fault. That's not the way to enter a room. There, that'll do. Good bye." Muffat stood in front of that closed door, utterly crushed by what he had just seen. His fit of trembling increased, a trembling which ascended from his legs to his chest and to his head. Then, like a tree caught in the hurricane, he staggered and fell on his knees, cracking in all his limbs, and despairingly holding out his hands, he muttered, "It is too much! Oh, God! It is too much!" He had accepted everything, but he could no longer bear it. He felt himself without strength, in that darkness where man succumbs with his reason. With an extraordinary outburst, holding high his joined hands, he sought heaven, he called on God. "Oh, no, I will not. Oh, come to me, my God. Help me, or rather let me die. Oh, no, not that man, my God. It is ended. Take me, carry me off, that I may no longer see, that I may no longer feel. Oh, I belong to thee, my God. Our Father which art in heaven." And he continued burning with faith, and an ardent prayer came from his lips. But someone touched him on the shoulder. He raised his eyes. It was Monsieur Venot, surprised at finding him praying before that closed door. Then, as though God himself had replied to his appeal, he threw himself into the little old man's arms. At last he could weep. He sobbed, and kept repeating, "My brother! My brother!" All his suffering humanity found relief in this cry. He bathed Monsieur Venot's face with his tears, he kissed him, uttering disconnected sentences. "Oh, my brother, how I suffer! You alone are left to me, my brother. Take me away for ever. Oh, for mercy's sake, take me away." Then Monsieur Venot pressed him to his bosom. He called him his brother also. But he had another blow to deal him. Since the previous day he had been seeking him to tell him that the Countess Sabine had crowned her follies by eloping with a young man employed at a large linen draper's, a frightful scandal of which all Paris was already gossiping. Seeing him under the influence of such a religious exaltation, he thought the moment a favourable one, and told him at once what had occurred, that flatly tragical end in which his house was foundering. The Count was not affected in the least. His wife had gone off, that was nothing to him, he would see about it later on. And, again giving way to his anguish, looking at the door, the walls, the ceiling, in a terrified manner, He could do no more than utter these imploring words: "Take me away. I can bear it no longer. Take me away." Monsieur Venot took him off like a child. From that time he was his entirely. Muffat once more returned to the strict duties of religion. His life was blasted. He had resigned his chamberlain's office in accordance with the desire of the offended modesty of the Tuileries. His daughter Estelle had commenced an action against him to recover a sum of 60,000 francs left her by an aunt, and which she ought to have received at the time of her marriage. Ruined, and living very moderately with the remnants of his great fortune, he allowed himself to be finished little by the countess, who devoured the leavings Nana had disdained. Sabine, corrupted by that woman's promiscuousness, incited to extremes, became the final sapper, the very canker of the home. After various adventures she had returned, and he had taken her back in the resignation of Christian pardon. She accompanied him like his living shame. But he, becoming more and more indifferent, ended by no longer suffering from such things. Heaven had rescued him from the arms of women to place him again in the very arms of God. It was a religious prolongation of Nana's voluptuous pleasures, with the stutterings, the prayers, and the despondencies, the humilities of an accursed creature crushed beneath the mud of his origin. In the dark corners of churches, his knees chilled by the cold stones, he found again his enjoyments of former days, the spasms of his muscles, and the delicious perturbations of his intelligence, in the same atonement of the obscure requirements of his being. The night of the rupture Mignon called at the Avenue de Villiers. He had got accustomed to Fauchery, he had ended by discovering 1,000 advantages in the presence of a husband at his wife's. He left to him all the little cares of the home, relied on him for an active supervision, and used the money that came from his dramatic successes for the daily expenses of the household. And as, on the other hand, Fauchery behaved very reasonably, never indulging in any ridiculous jealousy, but being as accommodating as Mignon himself with regard to the opportunities Rose had, the two men got on together better than ever, delighted with their association, so fertile in every kind of happiness, and each one making his nest beside the other, in a home where neither of them any longer stood on ceremony. It was regulated, it worked very well, they rivaled each other in their exertions for the common felicity. It just happened that Mignon had called, by Fauchery's advice, to see if he could not entice away Nana's maid, whose wonderful intelligence the journalist had fully appreciated. Rose was in great distress. For a month past she had had to put up with inexperienced girls who caused her continual embarrassments. As Zoe admitted him, he pushed her at once into the dining room. At the first word she smiled. It was impossible. She was leaving Madame, she was about to set up in business on her own account. And she added with an air of discreet vanity, that every day she was receiving proposals, all the ladies wanted her. Madame Blanche had offered her a bridge of gold to get her back. Zoe was going to acquire old Tricon's business, an old project which she had nursed for a long while, an ambition to realize a fortune in which she was about to invest her savings. She was full of great ideas. She dreamed of enlarging the concern, of taking a mansion, and collecting in it every pleasure. It was for this that she had even tried to get hold of Satin, a little blockhead who was now dying in the hospital, she had so ruined her health. Mignon having persisted in his offer, mentioning the risks one runs in business, Zoe, without explaining herself as to the nature of her projected establishment, contented herself with saying with a satisfied smile, just as though she had taken a confectioner's shop, "Oh, affairs of luxury always succeed. You see, I have been so long with the others that now I wish the others to be with me." And a ferocious feeling made her curl her lip. She would at last be Madame. She would have at her feet for the sum of a few louis those women whose slops she had been emptying for 15 years past. Mignon wished to see Nana, and Zoe left him for a minute, after saying that Madame had passed a very unpleasant day. He had only called there once, he did not know the house at all. The dining room, with its Gobelin tapestry, its sideboard, and its silver plate, amazed him. He familiarly opened the doors, and visited the drawing room and the winter garden, and then returned to the hall. And this excessive luxury, the gilded furniture, the silks and the velvets, filled him little by little with an admiration which caused his heart to bump. When Zoe came downstairs to fetch him, she offered to show him the other rooms, the bedroom, the dressing room. Then in the bedroom Mignon's heart almost burst. He was excited to the highest point of enthusiasm. That confounded Nana astounded him, he who was not easily surprised at anything. In the midst of the downfall of the establishment, of the waste and the massacring gallop of the servants, there was a pile of riches which stopped up the holes and covered the ruins. And Mignon, in the face of that magisterial monument, recalled many great works he had seen. Near Marseilles he had been shown an aqueduct, the stone arches of which spanned an abyss, a cyclopean work which had cost millions and 10 years of struggle. At Cherbourg he had seen the new harbour in course of construction, a gigantic undertaking, hundreds of men sweating in the sunshine, machines filling the sea with huge masses of rock, erecting a wall where at times workmen were squashed to a bloody pulp. But all that seemed small to him now. Nana exalted him far more, and in contemplating her work he experienced once again that sensation of respect experienced by him one night at an entertainment in a château which a sugar refiner had built, a palace the royal splendour of which had been paid for by one single thing — sugar. She had paid with something different, a bit of fun at which one laughed, a little of her delicate nudity. It was with this shameful and yet so mighty a nothing, the power of which excited the world, that all alone, without workmen, without machinery invented by engineers, she had shaken Paris and built up that fortune beneath which dead bodies were slumbering. "Ah, damn it all! What a tool!" exclaimed Mignon, enraptured, and with a return of personal gratitude. Nana, little by little, had become very sorrowful. At first the meeting of the Marquis and the Count had thrown her into a nervous fever, accompanied by a slight touch of gaiety. Then the thought of the old fellow who had gone off in a cab half dead, and of her poor Muff whom she would never see again, after having so often vexed him, brought about the beginning of a sentimental melancholy. After this she had got quite angry on hearing of Satin's illness. The girl had disappeared a fortnight before, and was now gradually dying at the Lariboisière Hospital, Madame Robert having put her into such a frightful state. As she was ordering a carriage to go and see the little baggage once more, Zoe had quietly given her a week's notice to leave. That threw her into despair. It seemed as though she was losing one of her family, and she implored Zoe to remain. The latter, highly flattered by Madame's grief, ended by kissing her to show that there was no ill feeling at parting. She was obliged to go. The heart was silent when business was in question. But that day was a day of worries. Nana, thoroughly disgusted, no longer thinking of going out, was wandering about her parlour, when La Bordette, who had come to tell her of some magnificent lace to be had at a bargain, mentioned between two other phrases about nothing at all, that Georges was dead. She turned icy cold. "Zizi dead!" she cried. And her glance, by an involuntary movement, sought the pink stain on the carpet. But it had vanished at last. The footsteps had worn it away. La Bordette, however, gave her some particulars. One did not know exactly how it happened. Some talked of a wound having opened, others told the story of a suicide — a plunge into one of the fountains at Les Fondettes. Nana kept repeating, "Dead! Dead!" Then she burst into sobs, and relieved her feelings pent up since the morning. It was an infinite sadness — something profound and immense which overwhelmed her. La Bordette having tried to console her about Georges, she waved her hand to make him desist, and said in broken tones, "It's not only him — it's all — it's everything. I'm very unhappy." "Oh, I know. They'll again say that I'm an abominable woman. That mother who is weeping there, and that poor man who was moaning this morning at my door, and the others, who are all ruined, after having squandered their sous with me. That's right. Give it to Nana. Give it to the beast. Oh, I've a broad back. I can hear them as though I was there. That dirty strumpet who entices everyone, who clears out some and kills the others, who causes pain to no end of people." She was forced to interrupt herself. Suffocated by her tears, she had fallen in her anguish across a sofa with her head buried in a cushion. The misfortunes she felt around her, those miseries that she had caused, enveloped her in a warm and continuous flow of sensibility, and her voice became lost in the plaintive accents of a little girl. "Oh, I suffer! Oh, I suffer! I cannot! It's stifling me! It's too hard not to be understood, to see every one put themselves against you, because they're the strongest. Yet, when one has nothing to reproach oneself with, when one has a free conscience — well, no! Well, no!" Her anger changed to indignation. She got up, wiped her eyes, and paced agitatedly about the room. "Well, no! They may say what they like, it isn't my fault. Am I cruel? I give all I have. I wouldn't hurt a fly. It's they. Yes, it's they. I never wanted to be unpleasant to any of them. And they were always hanging about my skirts, and now they croak, or beg, and all pretend to be in despair." Then, stopping in front of Labordette, and tapping him on the shoulder, she continued: "Come now, you were there. Speak the truth. Was it I who led them on? Weren't there always a dozen exerting themselves to invent something more abominable than the others? They disgusted me. I held myself aloof so as not to follow in their wake. I was afraid. Here is an instance. They all wanted to marry me. A nice idea! Eh? Yes, my dear fellow, I might have been 20 times a baroness or a countess if I had consented. Well, I refused, because I was reasonable. Ah! I preserved them from many detestable actions and many crimes. They would have stolen, murdered, killed father and mother. I had but to say a word, and I didn't say it. To day you see my reward. It's like that Dagonet whom I got married, a half-starved wretch whose position I made, after keeping him for nothing for weeks together. Yesterday I met him. He turned away his head. Well, go to the devil, pig! I'm not so foul as you are." She was walking about again. She violently banged her fist down on a small round table. "Damn it all, it's not just! Society is badly constructed. The women are abused, when it's the men who are entirely to blame. They expect such things. Listen, I can tell you now. In all I've ever had to do with men, well, I never had the least pleasure. No, not the least. They always bored me, on my word of honour. So I ask you now, if there's any fault of mine in all this? Ah, yes, they almost badgered me out of my life. Without them, my dear fellow, and what they've made me, I should be now in a convent praying, for I've always been religious. And hang 'em, after all, if they have left their money and their skin, it's their own fault. I've nothing to do with it." "Of course," said Labordette, convinced. Zoé ushered in Mignon. Nana received him smiling. She had had a good cry, but now it was over. He complimented her on her abode, still warmed with enthusiasm; but she soon let him see that she had had enough of her mansion. Now she was dreaming of something else. She would get rid of it all one fine day. Then, as he mentioned as a pretext for his visit a benefit performance to be given for old Busk, who was tied to his chair by an attack of paralysis, she expressed a great deal of sorrow, and took 2 boxes. Zoé, however, having said that the carriage was waiting, she asked for her bonnet; and as she tied the strings she related the story of poor Satin's mishap, then added, "I'm off to the hospital. No one ever loved me as she did. Ah, one is quite right in accusing men of having no hearts. Who knows? She's perhaps dead already. All the same, I shall ask to see her. I must kiss her once more." Labordette and Mignon smiled. She was no longer sad, she smiled also, for those 2 did not count, they could understand. And they both admired her in a thoughtful silence as she finished buttoning her gloves. She alone stood erect in the midst of the piled up wealth of her mansion, with a crowd of men trampled beneath her feet. Like those antique monsters whose dreaded domain was covered with bones, she trod on skulls, and catastrophe surrounded her. Vendeuve's furious conflagration; the melancholy of Foucarmont, drowned in the China seas; the collapse of Steiner, now forced to live as an honest man; the satisfied imbecility of La Falloise; and the tragic downfall of the Muffats, and Georges's white corpse watched over by Philippe, discharged from prison the day before. Her work of ruin and death was accomplished, the fly that had taken its flight from the filth of the slums, carrying with it the ferment of social decay, had poisoned these men merely by touching them. It was good, it was just. She had avenged her people, the rogues and the vagabonds from whom she sprang. And whilst in a halo her sex ascended and shone on her scattered victims, like a rising sun lighting up a field of carnage, she retained her unconsciousness of a superb beast, ignorant of her work, always good-natured. She remained big and plump, with beautiful health and unalloyed gaiety. But all that no longer counted. Her mansion seemed to her idiotic. It was so small, and full of a heap of furniture which was always in her way. A mere nothing, she only wanted to commence again. She dreamed, too, of something better. And she went off in a gorgeous costume to kiss satin a last time. Clean, solid, looking quite new, as though she had never been in use. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Nana by Émile Zola, translated by Burton Rascoe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 14. Nana abruptly disappeared. Another plunge, a wild prank, a flight into strange lands. Before her departure she procured herself the emotion of a sale by auction, sweeping everything off: the mansion, the furniture, the jewelry, and even the dresses and the linen. Figures were quoted. The 5 days produced more than 600,000 francs. For a last time Paris had seen her in a fairy piece, Mélusine, at the Gaiety Theatre, that Bourdonnais had audaciously taken without a sou. She was there with Prelière and Fontan. Her part was a dumb one, all show, but a real hit. 3 plastic postures of a powerful and silent fairy. Then, in the midst of this great success, when Bourdonnais, advertising mad, was covering Paris with colossal posters, it was stated one fine morning that the night before she had left for Cairo, a simple discussion with her manager, a word that had not pleased her, the caprice of a woman too rich to allow herself to be annoyed. Besides, it was a fad of hers. For a long time past she had longed to go and see the Turks. Months passed by. She was forgotten. Whenever her name was mentioned amongst her friends, the strangest stories circulated. Each gave contrary and prodigious information. She had captivated the Viceroy. She reigned in the innermost recesses of a palace over 200 slaves, whose heads she cut off to make her laugh. Not at all. She had ruined herself with a big negro, a filthy infatuation which had left her without a chemise, in the midst of the crapulous debauchery of Cairo. A fortnight later there was universal astonishment. Some one swore he had met her in Russia. A legend gradually developed. She was the mistress of a prince. Her diamonds were talked about. All the women were soon acquainted with them, through the descriptions that were current, without any one being able to give their source. Rings, bracelets, earrings, a diamond necklace as broad as 2 fingers, and a queenly diadem surmounted by a central brilliant as big as one's thumb. In the unknown of these far-off lands, she assumed the mysterious radiance of an idol covered with precious stones. Now she was only mentioned gravely, with the pensive respect for that fortune made amongst the barbarians. One July evening, towards 8 o'clock, Lucy, who was driving down the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, caught sight of Caroline Nequet, who had gone out on foot to give an order to a tradesman of the neighborhood. She called to her, and at once said, "Have you dined? Are you free? Oh, then, my dear, come with me. Nana has returned." The other, on hearing this, at once got into the carriage, and Lucy continued, "And you know, my dear, she is perhaps dead whilst we are talking." "Dead? What an idea!" cried Caroline in amazement. "And where? And of what?" "At the Grand Hotel, of the smallpox. Oh, quite a story!" Lucy had told her coachman to drive quick. So, as the horses rapidly trotted along the Rue Royale and the Boulevards, she related the story of Nana's adventure in broken sentences, and without once taking breath. "You can't imagine. Nana arrives from Russia, I forget why, a row with her prince. She leaves her luggage at the station, and goes off to her aunt. You recollect that old woman?" Good. She finds her baby ill with the smallpox. The baby dies on the morrow, and she has a row with the aunt about the money she ought to have sent, and which the other had never seen a sou of. It seems the child died of that. In short, the child was not well fed or looked after. Very well, Nana goes off, puts up at a hotel, then meets Mignon, just as she was thinking of fetching her luggage. She becomes very peculiar, she has the shivers, wants to be sick, and Mignon takes her to her room, promising to look after her affairs. Isn't it funny? Isn't it strange? But here's the best part. Rose hears of Nana's illness, is indignant at learning that she's all alone in an out-of-the-way place, and weepingly hastens to nurse her. You recollect how they detested each other? A couple of furies. Well, my dear, Rose had Nana removed to the Grand Hotel so that she might at least die in a swell place. And she's already passed 3 nights with her, and may very likely die of it afterwards. It's Labordette who told me all this, so I wanted to see." "Yes, yes," interrupted Caroline, greatly excited. "We will go." They had arrived. On the boulevard the coachman had been obliged to pull up in the midst of a block of vehicles and foot passengers. During the day the Corps Législatif had voted for a declaration of war. A crowd poured down from all the side streets and covered the footpaths and the roadway. At the Madeleine end the sun had set behind a blood-red cloud, the fiery reflection of which illuminated the tall windows. Twilight was coming on, a dull and melancholy hour, with the darkening avenues, which the gas lamps had not yet lit up with their bright specks. And amongst this mass of people on the march distant voices became louder, pale faces sparkled with animated glances, whilst a deep breath of anguish and of spreading stupor turned all heads. "There's Mignon," said Lucy. "He will give us some news." Mignon was standing under the vast portico of the Grand Hotel, with a nervous air about him as he watched the crowd. At the first questions Lucy put to him he flew into a passion, exclaiming, "I don't know. For the last 2 days I've not been able to get Rose away from up there. It's idiotic for her to risk her skin like that. She'll look nice if she catches it, with scars all over her face. It will suit us nicely." The idea that Rose might lose her beauty exasperated him. He would leave Nana just as she was, not understanding those silly devotions which women went in for. But here Fauchery crossed the boulevard, and when he had joined the others, he also anxiously asked for news, and then the 2 men tried to incite each other to go up. They were most affectionate to one another now. "Always the same, little 'un," observed Mignon. "You ought to go up and force her to come away." "Really, you're kind, you are," said the journalist. "Why don't you go up yourself?" Then, as Lucy inquired the number of the room, they both implored her to induce Rose to come down. Otherwise it would end by their getting angry. Lucy and Caroline, however, did not go up at once. They had caught sight of Fontan strolling along with his hands in his pockets, highly amused by the different faces in the crowd. When he learnt that Nana was upstairs ill, he remarked with a great display of feeling, "Poor girl! I will go and shake hands with her. What's the matter with her?" "Smallpox," replied Mignon. The actor had already taken a step in the direction of the courtyard, but he retraced it, and with a shiver simply murmured, "Ah, the deuce!" It was no joke catching smallpox. Fontan had nearly had it when he was 5 years old. Mignon related the story of one of his nieces who had died of it. As for Fauchery, he could talk of it, for he still bore the marks, 3 spots, which he showed to the others, close to his nose; and as Mignon pressed him again to go up, on the pretext that people never had it twice, he violently disputed that theory. He instanced cases, and called the doctors fools. But Lucy and Caroline, surprised at the vast increase of the crowd, interrupted them. "Look there! Look there! What a mob of people!" The night was advancing, the lamps in the distance were being lighted one by one. One could, however, distinguish spectators at the windows, whilst under the trees the human tide swelled every minute in one long stream from the Madeleine to the Bastille. The vehicles rolled slowly along. A kind of buzz arose from that compact mass, dumb as yet, assembled together in the idle desire of forming a crowd, stamping and excited with the same fever. But a huge commotion caused the crowd to fall back. In the midst of all the jostling, passing through the groups that made way for them, a band of men in caps and white blouses appeared, uttering this cry, to the time of hammers beating on the anvil: "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" And the crowd looked on with a gloomy distrust, already attracted nevertheless and stirred with visions of heroic deeds, the same as when a military band passes by. "Yes, yes, go and get your heads broken," murmured Mignon, seized with a philosophic fit. But Fontan thought it very grand. He talked of enlisting. When the enemy was at the frontier, all citizens ought to rise in arms to defend the fatherland, and he assumed a posture worthy of Bonaparte at Austerlitz. "Well, are you going up with us?" asked Lucy of him. "Ah, no," said he, "not to get ill." On one of the seats in front of the Grand Hotel sat a man, hiding his face in his handkerchief. Fauchery, on arriving, had drawn Mignon's attention to him with a wink. So he was always there. Yes, he was always there. And the journalist stopped the two women to point him out to them. As he raised his head they recognized him, and uttered a slight exclamation. It was Count Muffat, who glanced upwards at one of the windows. "You know he's been there ever since this morning," related Mignon. "I saw him at 6 o'clock. He has scarcely moved since. At the first words La Bordette uttered, he came and posted himself there, with his handkerchief over his face. Every half hour he crawls as far as here, to inquire if the person upstairs is better, and then returns to his seat. Well, you know it's not healthy, that room. One may love people without wishing to croak." The count, with upturned eyes, did not appear to be aware of what was going on around him. No doubt he was ignorant of the declaration of war. He neither felt nor heard the crowd. "Look," said Fauchery, "here he comes. Now just watch him." The count had indeed quitted his seat, and had entered under the lofty doorway. But the doorkeeper, who by this time had become accustomed to him, did not give him time to repeat his question. He said abruptly: "Sir, she died just a minute ago." Nana dead! It was a blow for all of them. Muffat, without a word, returned to the seat, his face buried in his handkerchief. The others cried out, but their voices were abruptly drowned as another crowd passed along, yelling, "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" Nana dead! Was it possible? Such a fine girl! Mignon sighed with relief. Rose would at last come down. There ensued a coolness. Fontan, who was longing for a tragic part, assumed an expression of grief, his mouth drawn down, his eyes turned up to the lids; whilst Fauchery, really affected in spite of his journalistic affectation of ridiculing everything, nervously champed his cigar. The two women, however, could not suppress their exclamations. The last time that Lucy had seen her was at the Gaiety Theatre, Blanche also in Melusine. Oh, she was grand, my dear, when she appeared in the midst of the Crystal Grotto. The gentlemen recollected very well. Fontan played Prince Cocorico. And, their memories awakened, they launched forth into interminable details. In the Crystal Grotto, was she not just fine with her rich nature? She did not say a word. The authors had even struck out a cue, because it interfered. No, nothing at all, it was far grander. And she electrified the audience merely by showing herself. A form such as one will never see again. Such shoulders, such legs, and such a waist! How queer that she should be dead! You know that over her tights she simply wore a golden sash round the hips, which was scarcely sufficient. Around her the grotto, all in glass, sparkled. There were cascades of diamonds, and strings of pearls trickled down amongst the stalactites of the roof. And in that transparency, in that pellucid spring, intersected by a broad ray of electric light, she appeared like a sun, with her skin and her hair of fire. Paris would ever see her thus, beaming in the midst of the crystal, poised in the air like a goddess. No, it was too stupid to allow oneself to die in such a position. Now she must be a pretty sight up there. And what pleasure wasted! Said Mignon, in the melancholy voice of a man who does not like to see good and useful things cast away. He sounded Lucy and Caroline to know if they still had the intention of going upstairs. Most certainly they were going up. Their curiosity had increased. Just then Blanche arrived, all out of breath, and exasperated with the crowd which blocked all the footpaths; and when she learnt the news the exclamations recommenced. The ladies moved towards the staircase, making a great noise with their skirts. Mignon followed them, calling out: "Tell Rose I'm waiting for her. At once, please. One doesn't know for certain whether the contagion is most to be feared at the commencement or towards the end," Fontan was explaining to Fauchery. "A house surgeon I know even assured me that the hours which follow death are most especially dangerous. Miasmata are expelled from the corpse. Ah! I regret this sudden end. I should have been so glad to have shaken her hand a last time." "What good would it do now?" asked the journalist. "Yes, what good?" repeated the other two. The crowd continued to increase. In the flood of light from the shops, beneath the dancing sheets of flaring gas, one could distinguish a sea of hats drifting in a double current along the footpaths. At this time the fever was passing from one to another. People joined the bands in blouses. A continuous pushing swept the roadway, and the cry returned, issuing from every throat, jerky and obstinate: "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" Upstairs on the 4th floor, the room cost 12 francs a day, Rose having desired something decent without being luxurious, however; for one does not want luxury when suffering. Hung in Louis XIII cretonne with large flowers, the room contained the mahogany furniture peculiar to all hotels, and a red carpet sprinkled with black foliage. A heavy silence reigned there, broken only by a whisper when voices resounded in the corridor. "I tell you we've lost our way. The waiter told us to turn to the right. What a barrack!" "Wait a minute. Let's see. Room 401. Room 401. Here. This way. 405, 403. This must be it. Ah, at last, 401. Come, hush, hush." The voices ceased. There was a slight coughing, then a momentary pause, and the door opened slowly, admitting Lucy, followed by Caroline and Blanche. But they halted. There were already 5 women in the room. Gaga was stretched out in the only easy chair, one in red velvet. Simone and Clarisse, standing in front of the fireplace, were conversing with Léa de Horn seated on a chair; whilst before the bed, to the left of the door, Rose Mignon, leaning against the woodwork of the foot, was looking fixedly at the corpse, lost in the shadow of the curtains. All the others had their bonnets and gloves on, like ladies out visiting; she only had bare hands, and her hair in disorder, her face pale with the fatigue of 3 nights of nursing. And there she stood, feeling stupid, with her features swollen from weeping, in the presence of that so sudden death. On the corner of the chest of drawers, a lamp with a shade lighted up Gaga with a brilliant flood of light. "Ah, what a misfortune!" murmured Lucy, as she squeezed Rose's hand. "We wanted to bid her good bye." And she turned her head to catch a glimpse of Nana, but the lamp was too far off, and she did not like to move it nearer. On the bed a grey mass lay stretched out. One could only distinguish the golden chignon, and a palish looking spot, which was probably the face. Lucy added: "I have never seen her since she was at the Gaiety Theatre in the grotto." Then Rose, shaking off her torpor, smiled and said: "Ah, she is altered, she is altered." And she returned to her contemplation without a gesture, without a word. Perhaps they would be able to look at her by and by; and the 3 women joined the others in front of the fireplace. Simone and Clarisse were talking in an undertone about the deceased's diamonds. Now, did they really exist, those diamonds? No one had seen them. It was probably all bosh. But Léa de Horn knew someone who was acquainted with them. Oh, some monstrous stones! Besides, that wasn't all. She had brought heaps of other riches from Russia: embroidered stuffs, precious knickknacks, a service of gold plate, and even furniture. Yes, my dear, 52 articles, some enormous cases, sufficient to load 3 luggage vans. It was all at the station. Ah, she had no luck, to die without even having time to unpack her things. And bear in mind that she also had some sous besides all these, something like 1 million. Lucy inquired who would inherit it all. Some distant relatives, the aunt very likely. A fine windfall for that old woman. She knew nothing yet. The invalid obstinately refused to have her informed, bearing her some ill will for the death of her youngster. Then they all pitied the little fellow, as they recollected having seen him at the races, a baby full of disease, and who looked so sad and so old, in short, one of those poor brats who never wanted to be born. He is far happier in his grave," said Blanche. Bah! And she also," added Caroline. Life isn't so pleasant after all." Gloomy ideas possessed them in the severity of that chamber of death. They were afraid. It was stupid to remain talking there so long; but a desire to see kept them rooted to the carpet. It was very warm. The lamp glass shone on the ceiling like a moon, in the damp shadow which filled the apartment. Under the bed a soup plate full of some disinfectant exhaled a most unsavoury odour. And now and again a slight breath of air swelled the curtains of the window, opened on to the boulevard, from whence arose a dull murmuring sound. Did she suffer much?" asked Lucy, who had been absorbed in the group above the clock, the three Graces, naked and smiling like opera dancers. Gaga appeared to wake up. Ah, yes, she did. I was there when she passed away. I can tell you that there is nothing beautiful in it. She was seized with a shivering fit." But she could not continue her explanation. A cry arose: "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" And Lucy, who was stifling, opened the window wide, and leant out on the balustrade. There it was pleasant. A delightful coolness came from the starry sky. On the opposite side of the way, windows were ablaze with light, whilst the reflections of the gas danced among the gilded letters of the signs. Then down the street it was very amusing. One could see the currents of the crowd roll like a torrent along the footpaths and the roadway, in the midst of a block of vehicles and large moving shadows, among which the lights of the shops and of the street lamps sparkled. But the band that now approached with loud shouts carried torches. A ray of red light came from the direction of the Madeleine, dividing the mob with a trail of fire, spreading afar over the heads like the reflection of a conflagration. Lucy, forgetting where she was, called to Blanche and Caroline, exclaiming: "Come, quick! You can see very well from here." All three leant out, greatly interested. The trees interfered with their view. At times the torches disappeared beneath the foliage. They tried to catch a glimpse of the gentleman waiting below, but the projection of a balcony hid the hotel entrance, and they could only distinguish Count Miffa, still huddled up on the seat like a dark bundle, his face buried in his handkerchief. A carriage had stopped, and Lucy recognized Maria Blonde, another one who was hastening there. She was not alone. A stout man got out after her. "Why, it's that thief Steiner," said Caroline. "What, hasn't he been packed back to Cologne yet? I shall like to see how he looks when he comes in." They turned round, but at the expiration of 10 minutes, when Maria Blonde appeared, after having twice mistaken the staircase, she was alone; and as Lucy questioned her with surprise, she exclaimed: "He? Ah, my dear, you make a mistake if you thought he was coming up. It's even wonderful for him that he came as far as the door with me. There's about a dozen of them downstairs, all smoking cigars." In truth, all those gentlemen were there. Come for a stroll just to see what was going on the boulevards, they had met together, and launched forth exclamations on the poor girl's death. Then they lapsed into politics and strategy. Bordenave, Dagonet, Labordette, Prullière, and others had swelled the group; and they were listening to Fontan, who was explaining his plan of campaign for capturing Berlin in 5 days. However, Maria Blonde, seized with compassion before the bed, was murmuring as the others had done: "Poor dear! The last time I saw her was at the Gaiety Theatre, in the grotto." "Ah, she is altered, she is altered," repeated Rose Mignon, with her smile of dull grief. 2 more women arrived: Tatanini and Louise Violaine. They had been wandering about the hotel for quite 20 minutes, sent from waiter to waiter. They had gone up and down more than 30 flights of stairs, in the midst of a host of travellers who were flying from Paris, in the panic caused by the declaration of war and the commotion on the boulevards. So, immediately on entering the room, they sank into some chairs, too fatigued to think of the deceased. Just then, a great noise was heard in the next apartment. There was a moving of trunks, a knocking about of furniture, mingled with a sound of voices uttering barbarous accents. The room was occupied by a young Austrian couple. Gaga related that, during the death agony, the pair had played at running after each other, and as there was a door between the two rooms, one could hear them laughing and kissing each time one of them was caught. "Well, I must be off," said Clarisse. "We can't bring her to life again. Are you coming, Simone?" They all glanced at the bed without stirring. Yet they were getting ready to leave, they gently smoothed down their skirts. At the window Lucy was again leaning out, but alone. A sadness brought a lump to her throat, as though a profound melancholy arose from that yelling mob beneath. Torches continued to pass, casting flakes of fire around. In the distance the various bands, huddled together in the darkness, looked like flocks of sheep driven at night time to the slaughter-house. And all that giddiness, those confused masses surging like the ocean, exhaled a terror, a great pity for coming massacres. They banished dull care, their shouts burst out in the intoxication of their fever rushing against the unknown, far away in the distance, behind the dark boundary of the horizon. "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" Lucy turned round, her back against the balustrade of the window, and looking very pale, exclaimed, "Good heavens! What will become of us?" The other women shook their heads. They were very grave and full of anxiety about what was happening. "I," said Caroline Equet in her sedate way, "I'm off to London the day after to morrow. Mamma is already there preparing a house for me. I'm certainly not going to stop in Paris to be massacred." Her mother, like a prudent woman, had invested all her money abroad. One never knows how a war may end. But Maria Blonde flew into a passion. She was patriotic. She talked of following the army. "There's a runaway for you! Yes, if they would let me, I would dress up as a man and go and shoot those Prussian pigs. And if we were all to croak, what next? A pretty thing our bodies are!" Blanche de Sivry was exasperated. "Don't speak against the Prussians. They are men like the others, and are not for ever bothering women like your Frenchmen. They've just expelled the little Prussian who was with me, a fellow awfully rich and gentle as a lamb, incapable of hurting any one. It's a disgrace. It'll ruin me. And, do you know, if I'm bothered too much, I'll go and join him in Germany." Then, whilst each had her say, Gaga murmured, in a doleful voice, "It's the end. I've no luck. Only a week ago I paid the last instalment for my little house at Juvisy. Ah, heaven knows what trouble it cost me. Lily had to help me. And now war's declared. The Prussians will come, they'll burn everything. How can I commence all over again at my age?" "Of course," added Simone, "it will be funny. Perhaps, on the contrary, we shall do—" And she completed her thought with a smile. Tête Nene and Louise Violaine were of the same opinion. The first one related that she had had some jolly times with soldiers. Oh, delightful fellows who would do anything for a woman. But having raised their voices too high, Rose Mignon, still leaning against the woodwork at the foot of the bed, made them leave off with a gentle "Hush!" They were startled, and glanced sideways towards the corpse, as though that request for silence had issued from the very shadow of the curtains. And in the heavy quiet that prevailed, that quiet of nothingness in which they were conscious of the rigidity of the corpse stretched out near them, the shouts of the mob burst out again. "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" But they soon forgot their fright. Léa de Horn, who had a political salon, where some of Louis Philippe's ex-ministers indulged in smart epigrams, resumed in a low voice, as she shrugged her shoulders, "What a mistake, this war! What awful stupidity!" Then Lucy at once defended the Empire. She had been kept by one of the imperial princes. For her it was a family matter. "Nonsense, my dear. We couldn't allow ourselves to be insulted any longer. This war is the honour of France. Oh, you know, I don't say that because of the prince. He was so stingy. Just fancy, every night he hid his louis in his boots, and whenever we played at Bezique he used beans, because one day I seized the stakes just for a joke. But that doesn't prevent my being just. The Emperor was in the right." Leah wagged her head with an air of superiority, like a woman who repeats the opinions of eminent personages. And raising her voice, she added, "It's the end. They're all mad at the Tuileries. France ought to have sent them to the right about yesterday rather than—" The others violently interrupted her. She was cracked. What was the matter with her? What had the Emperor ever done to her? Wasn't every one happy? Wasn't business in a flourishing state? Paris could never be livelier. Gaga flew into a passion, roused with indignation. "Shut up! It's idiotic! You don't know what you're saying. I lived in Louis Philippe's time, an epoch of toast and water and sordidness, my dear. And then came '48. Ah, a fine thing, a disgusting time, their Republic. After February I was actually starving, I tell you. But if you had passed through all that you would fall on your knees before the Emperor, for he's been our father. Yes, our father." They had to calm her. Then she resumed in a religious outburst. "Oh, God, give the Emperor the victory. Preserve us the Empire." All repeated the prayer. Blanche admitted that she burnt candles for the Emperor. Caroline, full of a religious feeling, had for 2 months past gone everywhere that she was likely to come across him, without succeeding in attracting his notice. And the others broke out into furious tirades against the Republicans, talked of expelling them beyond the frontier, so that Napoleon III, after vanquishing the enemy, might reign peacefully in the midst of the universal joy. "That beast Bismarck! There's a scoundrel for you!" observed Maria Blonde. "To think that I once knew him!" cried Simone. "If I had only known, I would have put some poison in his glass." But Blanche, still feeling aggrieved at the expulsion of her Prussian, dared to take Bismarck's part. He wasn't a bit wicked. Each one had his own duties. She added, "You know he adores women." "What's that to us?" said Clarisse. "You don't think we want him, do you?" "There are always too many men like him," gravely declared Louise Violine. "We had better do without them altogether than have any acquaintance with such monsters." And the discussion continued. They pulled Bismarck to pieces, each one gave him a kick in her Bonapartist zeal, whilst Tete Nene said in a vexed manner, "Bismarck! How they used to tease me about him! Oh, I owe him a grudge. I had never heard of him, that Bismarck. One can't know every one." "All the same," said Lea de Horn conclusively, "that Bismarck's going to give us a good hiding." She was unable to continue. The other women all flew at her. What? A hiding? It was Bismarck who was going to be sent back home with kicks behind. She had better shut up. She was unworthy to be a Frenchwoman. "Hush!" whispered Rose Mignon, feeling hurt at such a noise. The frigidity of the corpse again impressed them. They all ceased talking, uneasy, and brought anew face to face with death, with the secret dread of evil. On the boulevard the cry passed, hoarse and rending, "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" Then, just as they were making up their minds to leave, a voice called from the corridor, "Rose! Rose!" Gaga, surprised, opened the door and disappeared for a moment. Then when she returned, she said, "My dear, it's Fauchery who is there at the end of the passage. He won't come any nearer. He is in an awful state because you persist in remaining here with the body." Mignon had succeeded in inciting the journalist. Lucy, still at the window, leant out; and she caught sight of the gentleman waiting on the pavement, looking up and making signs to her. Mignon, exasperated, was holding up his fists. Steiner, Fontan, Bordenave, and the others were opening their arms in an anxious and reproachful way; whilst Daguenet, so as not to compromise himself, was quietly smoking his cigar, his hands behind his back. "I was forgetting, my dear," said Lucy, leaving the window open. "I promised to make you go down. They're all beckoning for us." Rose moved away painfully from the foot of the bedstead. She murmured, "I will go down. I will go down. She no longer wants me now. We will send for a Sister of Charity." And she looked about without being able to find her bonnet and shawl. She mechanically filled a basin with water at the washstand, and washed her hands and face, as she continued, "I don't know how it is, but it's been a great shock to me. We were not very nice to each other. Well, now I feel quite stupid. Oh, I've all sorts of ideas, a longing to die myself. The end of the world. Yes, I want some fresh air." The dead body was beginning to fill the room with a fearful stench. There was quite a panic after such a long period of unconcern. "Let's be off, my dears," repeated Gaga. "It isn't healthy." They left the room quickly, throwing another glance towards the bed. But as Lucy, Blanche, and Caroline were still there, Rose gave a last look round to see that all was tidy. She drew the curtain before the window. Then she thought that the lamp was not proper — there ought to be a candle. And after taking one of the brass candlesticks from the mantelpiece she lit the candle, and placed it on the night table beside the corpse. A bright light suddenly illuminated the face of the deceased. It was horrible. They shuddered, and hastened away. "Ah, she is altered, she is altered," murmured Rose Mignon, who was the last to leave the room. She went off and closed the door. Nana was left alone, her face turned upwards in the candlelight. It was a charnel house, a mass of matter and blood, a shovelful of putrid flesh, thrown there on the cushion. The pustules had invaded the entire face, one touching the other; and faded, sunk in, with the greyish aspect of mud, they already seemed like a mouldiness of the earth on that shapeless pulp, in which the features were no longer recognizable. One of the eyes, the left one, had completely disappeared amidst the eruption of the purulence. The other, half open, looked like a black and tainted hole. The nose still continued to suppurate. A reddish crust starting from one of the cheeks invaded the mouth, which it distorted in an abominable laugh; and on this horrible and grotesque mask of nothingness, the hair, that beautiful hair, retaining its sun-like fire, fell in a stream of gold. Venus was decomposing. It seemed as if the virus gathered by her in the gutters, from the tolerated carrion, that ferment with which she had poisoned a people, had ascended to her face and rotted it. The room was deserted. A strong breath of despair mounted from the boulevard and swelled the curtain. "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" End of chapter 14. End of Nana by Émile Zola, translated by Burton Rascoe. Recorded by Celine Major.